Okay, so I guess we can start this first online seminar, IDEE online seminar of the year. Thank you very much for being here. We have the pleasure to welcome Chris Brown from the University of Southampton. And Chris will tell us about his experiment around networks for learning. So thank you very much, Chris, for being with us. And the floor is yours. We have a session of 1 hour, including questions, probably. Maybe some will come at the end, maybe some will come as you go.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, so the kind of title of this talk is Networks for Learning, which was taken from the name of a book that I published with myself and Cindy Portman. But what I want to do with this session really is to cover a number of things. Obviously, I know you have an interest in methods, but I'll be talking about a concept first. So the concept of professional learning networks, and to look at the role of school leaders and school leadership in making sure this idea of professional learning networks can be as effective as possible. And then to touch on what we've learned from our studies into learning networks, so the kind of methods we used and why we use those methods, and what they've kind of taught us about research learning networks or professional learning networks, and in particular, a research learning network in England. So to begin with the concept then, the idea of a professional learning network is that it represents a group of people. The work of kind of Wenger is quite apt here because it's akin to a community of practice. But it's different also from a community of practice because it's about people who leave their community of practice to go and meet others from different communities of practice, to engage with those people, to learn, and then to take back their understanding of what they've done to their own community of practice and to share that learning. So often then, if we think about a community of practice, it would be people have a common understanding of the world, a common set of practices and so on. And so with a professional learning network, we're talking about a range of people from, for example, schools, different schools and school leaders, different groups of schools and teachers, perhaps policymakers, national policymakers, local policymakers, possibly even academic researchers. So each one of those groups leaves their everyday set of practices, comes together, learns, and goes back. And what's interesting is that we've done some work recently on, why PLNs have been kind of growing and flourishing. And in fact, a lot of PLNs started with the coronavirus. And if we look at the work, the kind of thinking of Andreas Schleicher here, he talks about this idea of change taking place in a deep crisis and that possibility that emerges from a crisis, that we can do something different. And what we've certainly found, not only in England, but also elsewhere, is that a lot of professional learning networks emerge from COVID-19 to help connect together different groups that faced very common problems. So how do you educate children in a period of disruption? How do you maintain professional development of teachers in this moment of disruption? How do you connect together communities, perhaps from rural areas that weren't otherwise connected? Looking at it graphically, so a professional learning network, I mentioned before, you have these communities of practice and then you have people leaving. So the dotted lines here on the diagram are specific communities of practice. So we may have a community of practice of school teachers, a community of practice of academic researchers, and so on. And one or two teachers from those groups will leave. So the white stars in each of those diagrams will leave their community of practice and they'll form this network in the middle. That network will engage in a process of understanding, of development, and then take that back into their school. And what this means ultimately is that this is an approach where just one or two people can actually help the development and the growth and the emergence of new practices for others. And when I think about the work of IDEE and this idea of understanding what works, what's effective, and how that can be shared with other schools, this is a cost-effective and efficient way of doing that, because it means you can engage teachers with those, what works type practices. And then they become champions that go back and make that change happen in their school. So not everybody has to learn about these things, only one or two people, and then they can share those more widely. So to make that happen, we need school leaders to be able to kind of work with their teachers, because what we know about effective professional learning networks is that they work when teachers are able to take what they've learned and come back and keep improving that in the school. And to do that, they need the support of their school, but they also need to be able to show positive outcomes. So as I said, if you're looking at kind of what works type evidence, and how that can be applied, you need to be able to say, look, this is a new way of working, and this is why it's effective. This is why it helps, and to be able to demonstrate that quite concretely. The other thing to notice about PLNs is that they have a number of supporting conditions. If they're going to work effectively, they have supporting conditions which include a common focus. The people coming together from the community of practice need to agree on a theme or on a topic that matters to them. They need to be typified by collaboration. There's the benefit of having people from many different sites and settings is that they're able to offer something different. But to be able to take advantage, to really profit from that expertise that's in the room, you need to be able to engage in collaboration. You need to be able to promote learning of individuals. And typically that's done through reflective professional inquiry. So the idea that you are perhaps, if we're looking at, what works in terms of feedback or what works in terms of teaching mathematics, to help teachers experiment with that, to see how that can be actualized and how that can be made real in their own school, and to work with others to be able to share that in detail. And then, of course, there's leadership. And, we know leadership is important. We know that actually school leaders, certainly, in the UK and in the US, as well as other places, have a key role in school in terms of how that school runs, what the vision is for that school, how the resources are allocated within that school, how staff members are developed within that school. And if you've got that freedom and that ability, then we need to know how school leaders can use the visionary aspects of their role, but also the kind of resource allocating aspects of their role to make these PLNs part of the way schools work, to make sure that teachers are able to profit from membership of a professional learning network, and to make sure that actually the school, by opening up to new practices, can really benefit. And I think it's interesting here to introduce the work of Marcus Peach and colleagues, who talk about this idea of ambidextrous leadership. So ambidexterity means being able to use both hands, right? So as a leader, what does it mean to, on one hand, be able to kind of look out for new innovation, to look out for new opportunities to exploit, while at the same time being able to manage one's current resources effectively, and to be able to get the most out of what one has. And there's an assumption, certainly in the work of Marcus Peach and colleagues, that if you've got school leaders who are able to look outside, have this open innovation approach, are able to look outside for new opportunities, they can then actually, their school really benefits as a result, and they're able to then internalize these innovations, and then to transform them, but also to push new innovations out to others. So everybody benefits as a result. And then from my own work and my colleague Jane Flood, some of the things that we expect school leaders to be able to do that are kind of based on both the work of Peach, but also the kind of notion of that list of leadership capabilities, is to be able to formalize and prioritize. So if you want to work with professional learning networks, you need to make sure that actually that's part of the policies and the procedures and the activities that go on within a school. So you might have a school improvement plan, you might have performance monitoring, you might have stakeholders that are concerned with the governance of the school. And if you're really serious about opening yourself up as a school and engaging with others, then you need to kind of have those that engagement reflected in your policies. But you also need to be able to prioritize. You need to be able to allocate resource and organize structures to ensure that actually PLNs can be engaged with, and that it's an important thing to engage with professional learning networks. One of the dangers that happens in UK schools quite a lot is that school leaders go, yes, this is important, until the next important thing comes along. But if you're serious about something, you have to keep it front of mind, I think. And then finally, the kind of the mobilizing structures that occur within a school. If the idea is that you have new ideas coming in, they need to be shared in a way that everybody can benefit. So if we look at the idea of a PLN as being one in which people leave their community of practice, typically then you are getting teachers out of the formal hierarchy, getting them to engage, and then getting them to come back in the school. But we need to do two things. First of all, we need to make sure that when teachers come back into the school, they're doing that as experts. They're able to use new policies in an expert way, or new practices in an expert way. And we also need to make sure that the people that come back in have the freedom to be able to innovate. So if I start with the first of those, this idea of expertise is basically one in which when teachers join the professional learning network, when they come back into schools, we want them to work with their colleagues in a way that they can use those new practices, those new procedures quite quickly and quite easily. And as an expert, the difference between an expert and a novice is that as a novice, which is kind of the lowest form of expertise, we tend to use instructions. Okay, so when I learn to drive a car, I have instructions. I have an understanding of the procedures I need to follow, the speed limit on the roads, the distance between cars that is good for braking and so on. But it's only when I actually perform those actions that I get an understanding of how to apply those rules in a real life context. And then as you get more hours on the road, you get an understanding of how to drive in in raining conditions, how to drive in very small roads. We have a lot of kind of very small roads in England, and it's very difficult to drive on them and so on. So it's only when you kind of get those hours behind the wheel that you become an expert, right? And the same thing you could say with any procedure. You have instructions like this diagram here, but over time, you kind of understand how to apply those in practice, what you might want to do in one situation, what you might want to do in another situation, what you might do if you're on a train and there's no soap, or what you might want to do if there's no hand dryer, and so on. So you have to develop this expertise as you go along. And this is another example here. So in England, we have how do you cross the road? We have a special code for how you cross the road, how we teach children to cross the road, right? But that code is 5 stages long. I mean, it starts with, think, then you stop, then you use your ears and your eyes, and then you wait, and then you look around, and then you come back and you're alive. And actually, nobody crosses the road like that once they're an adult, right? It's only we do it when we're children. We want to teach our children how to cross the road in this very safe way. But certainly these days, if I cross the road, I kind of just run, when it's safe or whatever else. And so that's me, because I've become an expert. I know when it's okay to do that, when it's okay to wait. So what it means for teachers is that ultimately we want them to be engaging with these new practices that come in from the professional learning network as experts, and to be able to do that so that they are delivering most benefit to their children. So we can measure expertise, and there's a way of measuring expertise. which comes from the work of Hall and Horde. And you have a kind of you begin with no level of use. I don't understand something. I don't know. I understand how to cross the road. Then you start with preparation. I'm preparing to learn to cross the road. I've acquired information on how to cross the road. And then you might do that in a very mechanical way. You might follow the instructions. You might stop. You might look. You might listen. You might do that over and over again. But as you become an expert, you can vary the use of the innovation. You can combine that innovation with other things. You can make major modifications. But the benefit of doing those things is you understand if they're more effective or less effective for children, for students, and so on. And so we can equate expert use to engaging in a more beneficial use of an innovation for particular groups of people. So that was a kind of overview of the concepts I wanted to talk about. The idea that I've been looking at is a particular form of professional learning network. So it's a research learning network. And we began this kind of idea or this concept of research learning networks probably about 13 years ago, when the Education Endowment Foundation, which is a kind of what works centre in England, wanted to understand how to promote research informed practices effectively across schools. And so the idea was that we suggested this notion of research learning networks, that that the research learning networks would be a form of professional learning network. You would involve one or two teachers from groups of schools who would come together. They would learn about a particular form of research or a particular practice that's research informed. They would trial that with their colleagues. They would then roll it out generally as a kind of process of change management. And our original approach was undertaken through a randomized control trial. So we recruited 110 schools. That was interesting but difficult, because you're trying to persuade schools that are busy to take part in an experiment of which only half will get the treatment, right? So you have to kind of persuade them that it's worthwhile, even if they don't get the research learning network activity. How do you do that? You can offer them a wait list, for example. You can say you'll get it 2 years later when the experiment's finished. We'll keep you updated. Interestingly, some of those schools decided they were going to do their own approach anyway, so that kind of invalidated their usefulness as a control group, because they decided that this was such a good idea they were going to put it in place. Nonetheless, we also experience other difficulties with the research learning network model, because we are talking about schools that have to be geographically close to one another, because the idea of a professional learning network is that teachers come out, they engage, they go back to their schools, but to be able to do that, ideally you want them to be within driving distance, because for sure you can do online networks, but if you've never met face to face with someone, the kind of level of trust, the level of collaboration is likely to be much lower. The other thing we had to do as well is, that affects the randomization, because you've obviously got to get groups of schools. You've then got to identify groups of schools, maybe 5 or 6 schools in a group, to a cluster. So the randomization had to take place in a kind of cluster. So again, that was quite interesting, understanding how effectively to randomize based on that kind of cluster method. And because the Education Endowment Foundation is interested in school outcomes and in student outcomes, their outcome measure wasn't actually research literacy, it was student outcomes. It was the kind of high stakes performance outcomes that we test for in the UK. So the kind of theory of action was that not only did we have to prove that engaging with research was happening, but that engagement with research also led to improvements in student outcomes. So that's quite a complicated chain. One of those is fairly easy. We can say that, whether as a result of joining a research learning network, teachers in schools were engaging with more research, felt comfortable and to engage with research, were happy with engaging with research. But to actually say, as a result of that, student outcomes increased is quite a big big task. And nonetheless, the randomized control trial evaluation, it wasn't carried out by me, it was carried out by the University of Bristol, did indicate that in primary schools, teachers engaged with research and they could see an improvement in primary student outcomes. So we were pleased with that. It wasn't a huge increase, but it did exist. So, I thought that was important and exciting. But with this particular model, as I said, there were one or two teachers that came out of schools to work together. We used what we call a cycle of inquiry. So these teachers met for 4 workshops during a year. In the first workshop, it was discovery. It was, okay, what's the situation in your school? What does the research say about, for example, feedback? Then the second one was about, let's develop a new intervention that will change the situation in your school based on the research. The third workshop was about, how do we try that intervention out and see if it's effective in your school? And then the fourth workshop was about whole school change. How do you then lead that change in your school? So that required facilitators. It required us to kind of work with teachers to develop materials for teachers, and so on and so forth. But we've started to expand this. So, recently we ran research learning networks for looked after children. These are children that are in social care. We've done it also in different countries and so on. So, it's a model that seems to work across different subject types. And just to kind of repeat that cycle of inquiry approach, we actually used 4 workshops, but broadly, this is what we did. We were like, where do we want to get to as teachers, as schools? What's our vision? What's our current situation? How do we know? What does the data say? What data do we need to collect and what does it say? What does the research say about the topic we're interested in? Let's develop a research-informed action plan. Let's test that out with 1 or 2 colleagues. Let's see if it works. Let's adjust that. Let's roll it out across all colleagues. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, so that's research learning communities as a whole. I also wanted to talk to you about a particular case study that we looked at, which again, I think we used some interesting methods, which I think showed some interesting findings. And I thought maybe this might be of help as well, especially when you're thinking about, as an organization, how do you get teachers and schools to engage with the kind of research findings you're bringing together, the kind of research findings that you're developing as an organization. If you're about kind of understanding what's effective and what works, how do we share that more generally? So we did a very in-depth case study of one research learning network that was in Hampshire, and this was just 3 schools because the schools were in a forest. There wasn't 5 schools we could draw on. So this seemed like an appropriate cluster. But what we wanted to do was to see how the use of research-informed interventions was emerging and taking place and kind of developing in these particular schools. So we did a social network analysis. We did surveys of staff. We did questions with school leaders. And we were interested in the interactions between school leaders, how they engaged with the new intervention, what leaders thought, what's the culture of the school thoughts, and does all these things make a difference? Now, if you're not familiar with social network analysis, basically the point of the social network analysis is you want to understand the interactions that occur in a school, who talks to who about what. And so broadly, you do that by if you take one school, you've got to know the names of all the teachers, all the people that work in a school. And then you present those in a questionnaire and you say, who do you talk to about professional development? How often do you talk to that person? How do you rate the quality of that relationship? How could it be made better? And what you're able to do is end up with diagrams like this. So basically on the left-hand side, we have 3 schools. The little shapes, we have white and grey and black, are a different school. So the white shapes are St. Swathe School, the teachers in St. Swathe School. The black circles are the teachers in Cedric School. And the kind of grey shapes are the teachers in Northwood School. And within that, you have different types of teachers. So, you know, the circles are teaching assistants, the squares are teachers, and so on. The diamonds are senior leaders. And the first question we asked was about, you know, when the member of the research learning network has come back into the school, who talks to that person about the intervention? Who talks to that person about what they've learned and about the kind of understanding and the new ideas that they're bringing back into the school? And what you can see there is that in the top school, in St. Swathe School, there's lots of conversation because there are lines between all of the different teachers, right? So if the line represents a form of communication, you can see that many of those teachers are talking to one another. So that the line is created because in the survey we say, do you talk to Jane? Do you talk to Henry? Do you talk to so-and-so? And in that school, you know, there's maybe one person where there's no line, so they're not talking to anybody. But there's lots of engagement. There's lots of talking that's taking place. In the other two schools, there is less conversation, it would seem, about this. So people are coming back from the research learning network, and there seems to be less conversation that's happening between teachers. And we thought, oh, that's, you know, that doesn't look so good. But then we wanted to look at something more. So more than just talking, we wanted to look at interaction, collaboration. So when these teachers come back from their research learning networks, to what extent do they have conversations plus collaborative professional development activities? So to what extent are those members of the professional learning network effectively or essentially mirroring that cycle of inquiry? So they are saying, okay, well, we went to this professional learning network and we learned about the vision. What do we think the vision is here? Here is the research we learned about in the professional learning network. What would you do with it? And so kind of taking them through a matching cycle of inquiry within their own school. And what we can see then is there's a big difference. If you look at Northwood School, on the right-hand side of the diagram, if you look at Northwood School, well, when we looked at just conversation, there was no action, nothing much going on at all. But in terms of looking at conversation plus professional development, there's lots of interaction. Everybody's talking to each other. Everybody's collaborating with each other. Whereas in the school that's called St. Swathes, in the diagram on the left, there's conversation. But as we can see on the diagram on the right, there is no collaboration. There is no proper engagement at all. Those teachers are only talking to each other. They are not fully interacting. They are not engaging in a form of kind of collaboration at all. And I think that's important because when we go back to that notion of expertise, and when I said, you know, we can measure expertise, well, we asked them, the teachers, to what extent are you engaging with this new interaction? To what extent are you using it to improve your teaching and learning? And what was clear here was that in the school where there was lots of interaction, people who reported expert use were much, much higher than in the school where there was just conversation. So in the school where there was just conversation, which is school S on this table, you know, 10% of people said or 11% of people said they weren't using it, or they were just preparing to use it. Whereas school N reported a much higher kind of level of expertise. Now, these are really small sample sizes, and I completely admit that, but I think it's very interesting that we can start to see a connection there between expertise and the level of collaboration that goes on in a school. So in terms of what that's telling us, you know, we can see that something is driving within school N, particularly this more collaborative approach. And as part of that, it means that the teachers there are going beyond this conversation to actually kind of sharing resource and sharing the learning of the professional learning network more effectively. Now, we decided to look at the idea of distributed leadership. Now, distributed leadership is a form of leadership practice that is kind of collegial and sense making, and probably more effectively, distributed leadership is about when a teacher is empowered, is able to interact with others, and has the ability to lead. So, excuse me for a second. So in this case, are teachers able to leave the professional learning network and feel that they are have the authority to lead a process of change in their school? Are they able to interact with others in their school in order to make that that change real? And do they have the capacity as leaders? Do they have the knowledge as leaders to do that? And others have talked about this idea of distributed leadership in a much more detailed way. So we have the work of Cotter, for example, who talks about this notion of, in a dual system, when you have a network that connects to a hierarchy, it has to mesh effectively with that hierarchy. If it's treated as a task force, if it's treated by school leaders as, okay, you leave and go and join the network, and then you report to us and you tell us what you learnt, and we'll decide if we want to go ahead with it, that's not going to be effective. So if we look at this kind of, go back to this slide here, when these people leave the network, what they need to do is not have to wait for the authority of the school leader at the top before they engage in change, but they need to be given the freedom and the autonomy to innovate. Okay, so we were interested. We thought, okay, well, if these things are happening at the school level, are we witnessing a form of distributed leadership, and how can we find that out? So we conducted interviews with the teachers in the schools, and what we found out there was indeed that there was a form of distributed leadership going on. So one in the school where there was lots of conversation and not much action, what we found was that participants were given the authority to develop new approaches for teaching and learning, but they were only asked to encourage others to use them. So they were said, please just go away and talk about that approach with others. Whereas in the school N, Northwood School, teachers were empowered to make decisions in relation to new teaching and learning practices, and they were responsible for facilitating that process. They were given the kind of change agent role, the change agent task. So, and they did this in a form of a professional learning community, and I think that's really important, because I'm just going to skip the rest of this slide for the moment, just put this graph up, because actually this is data from the OECD that kind of shows where there's effective collaboration and where there isn't effective collaboration. So we can see what forms of effective collaboration are important, that the research says actually makes a difference, and we can see what forms of professional collaboration don't. But we can also see, if you look at the green charts, most schools across the OECD, so this is some 100+ countries, engage in less effective activities, just the exchange of information at least once a month. Whereas professional collaboration, the things that really make a difference in terms of building that expertise, so teaching jointly, observing other teachers, engaging in joint activities, participating in collaborative learning, and so on, that tends to happen either never or less than once a month. So in one hand, we're interested then, if our teachers are doing the stuff, or the teachers in this school are doing the stuff on professional collaboration, shouldn't teachers be doing that more generally? Because clearly it results in a more coming together of teachers, in engagement of teachers, but also of the sharing of practices in an effective way. And other teachers become experts, which mean they can be more effective for their children. So kind of bringing this back together to the idea of, how do you share what works in a meaningful way? My argument would be that we want to get ownership of this research by teachers who can work with it and work with other teachers to understand how it can be used within their school. As I said, one of the ways then you can do that form of effective collaboration is a professional learning community. Professional learning communities have been kind of typified or characterized by having a shared sense of vision and purpose, a kind of collegial approach in which we all take responsibility for the students in the school, that we go beyond this form of kind of sharing information to actually working with one another. So rather than just saying, yes, here is some information to help you, we say, actually, let's look about how we can put this together and build a new intervention for you, and how we can test that out and how we can make that work. But also having a culture of trust and inquiry is important. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. And then finally, welcoming diverse perspectives. And I think that's important as well, because if we have a school which can have, 200, 300 years worth of experience in it, we need to make sure that we draw on that effectively. We need to make sure that the values and the work of teachers is really, really welcome. So we know that when they're done well, professional learning in collaborative communities like professional learning communities lead to improvements in teaching practice. And we also know that that's probably because of this notion of a learning conversation that takes place. Now, this is a model that was developed by Japanese business economist Nonaka and Takuchi some time ago. But what they found was in a learning organization, or in an organization that performs effectively, you treat knowledge in a very specific way. So first of all, you become very clear about what you already know. And that's important, because if you've got a room of teachers, as I said, they may have 200 years of experience, 300 years of experience. Making sure we understand what concepts we're talking about, but also making sure we say to each other, well, this is what my understanding of effective practice is. When it comes to feedback, this is what I believe is important. So you talk about that, you get a common understanding of what you know. Then you put that together with some research. So you say, okay, how does the research deepen our understanding? How does it enhance our knowledge of this issue? What does it give us? How have we co-constructed something completely different that marries together knowledge of what works or whatever else with our understanding? And then how do you take an intervention that's based on this co-constructed knowledge, start to trial and embed that within your school? And then how do you do that so that it becomes a way of life? And actually, if we think about those examples of expertise, this is kind of the way we develop expertise, because we are taking the knowledge that is presented to us, we're trialing it, we're combining it with what we know as people and our experience, and it then becomes a way of life. So once we've learned to drive a car for such a long period of time, eventually we don't even think about it. It just becomes a process until something perhaps strange happens and we kind of start to think about driving again. So what we need to achieve in schools then really is that we should be developing forms of distributed leadership where staff are actively involved in decisions about innovation, how to adopt that innovation, how to engage with it, how to test it out, how to keep going and continuing to use it. So they have agency. So I think one of the kind of controversies of a lot of what works type approaches in the UK is that this idea of fidelity, this idea of actually you have to replicate with fidelity an intervention in each school. Whereas understanding why that intervention was effective and how it could be tailored, but without losing the key important aspects of that intervention, I think make a fundamental difference here. I'm going to realize that I've kind of been talking a bit too long, and I know you want questions, so I'm going to skip through these slides and just kind of talk about trust and innovation. So in high trust schools, we know that individuals feel supported to take risks, to innovate, and that's important. We also know that when school cultures are attuned to innovation, they're more likely to take on board research. So we were interested in whether this has an impact on how research gets used within schools. But what's really interesting, going back to those 3 schools that I talked about, when we used a trust scale to measure levels of trust in the school, we explored, this is a pretty standard trust scale, where it looks at in difficult situations, staff can depend on each other, staff respect each other, and so on. Actually, there didn't seem after a while to be that much difference or that much of a relationship between levels of trust and whether staff were engaging in an innovation and whether they were doing it in an expert way. And the same is true with innovation. So when we use the innovation scale to explore whether schools experiment with new ways of working, whether there's a kind of forum for innovation within the school and so on, the findings were quite mixed. And that kind of made me think of Herzog's work here on hygiene factors. So, if we go to a restaurant and we have a clean knife and a clean fork in front of us, we don't kind of say anything. We just say, thanks, I'm going to eat my dinner. If we have dirty knife and fork, be like, no, we complain, right? So I wonder whether the same is true with trust and innovation. To a certain point, they will help us achieve research use in schools. But after that, it becomes just a norm. Having people score 5 on a 5-point scale may be no different from them scoring a 3.5 or a 4. You have to get a basic level of trust, and then you can kind of carry on. So the last things I'm going to leave you with are other clues as to what's been going on in these schools. So social influence as a form of leadership. We know that leadership isn't just about hierarchical leadership. It's about looking at the interconnectivity and the kind of influence that flows, or the social capital that flows within an organization. And again, social network analysis can help us understand that more effectively. If you've got diagrams like this, where we're kind of saying, who is central within a school? Who is the person that everybody talks to, or everybody seeks advice from, or everybody, goes to before they make a decision? Understanding those particular people can be powerful for initiating change. Because if those are the people that say, yeah, actually, what you need to do is look at this piece of research, or this particular intervention has been research informed and is very good. If we can get those people on board, and we measure that through the same process of social network analysis as we did with the schools, then we can target those people and help them achieve change. So this is the idea of opinion formers and identifying opinion formers through social network analysis. So this is something we've been working on in terms of understanding, if we're going to get members of this professional learning community, who should those people be, and how do we get hold of them? The other thing I'm going to talk about is why people adopt new things. Okay. And if you're like me and you get a new television or a new computer, it just fills you with dread, because I don't want to learn something. I just want it to work. Right. So, and the same is true with teachers and new innovation. So, having to deal with something new is sometimes problematic. It's sometimes difficult. It's scary. So being able to promote these particular, attributes of an innovation, to show why it's better, to show why it agrees with what, or is compatible with what we did before, to show why it's not complex, to show that it works, can all help us adopt new innovations. So final thoughts are really about, this kind of approach that I've been talking about. There's the method side of things, but there's also the social side of change. And that can be difficult. If we want things to happen, we need to cede control. We need leaders to cede control. And we need our teachers to be empowered as agents of change. But I'm going to finish there, because I don't want to kind of take up your question time. And I apologize, I was a little bit longer than I was hoping to be, but I would welcome any questions you may have. I think you're on mute, Mark.
Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much. Do we have questions or comments in the room? Yes, Ignacio. Nice to almost see you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Chris, for this presentation. Really exciting. So I am running a bit similar kind of program here in France. So it's really nice to see this work. I have a couple of questions more on the methods you used, in particular for your social network analysis. How did you measure collaboration to build up edges between educators in the different schools? And then the second question is that as you saw that schools in which the networks were more were less sparse or more concentrated, you saw that the level of expertise of these educators was higher. Did you saw also that in these schools the students' improvement was also higher?
Yeah, thank you. Just taking that second question first. Yeah, absolutely. There was the problem is this was a case study of a bigger project. So I'd like to do a bigger study on it, but yeah, absolutely. We saw improvements in many things, not only student outcomes, but teacher kind of happiness, well-being, so on and so forth. So, that was really positive. The collaboration was interesting because our work really was getting the collaboration between the members of the professional learning network, not within the school. So we developed a whole package of resources and materials that was kind of always fostered on making collaboration work. So activity, it's almost like being a teacher, and having activities that you're trying to get different teachers to work on, but also getting them to understand and engage with research as well at the same time. So it was a kind of collaborative approach to working on research. But was that answering your question? Sorry, your first question. I wanted to make sure I get that properly.
Yeah, well, properly. It's more about what was the tool you used to measure the actual collaboration, to decide there is an edge,
I see. Sorry.
A tie between this teacher and this teacher.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah, I was working with Alan Daly in University of California, and he had some tools he'd already used. So it was, do you talk to person X about, and then you put in the innovation or whatever else. What is the quality of that relationship? And it was a 5-point scale. How often do you talk to that person? And it was a 5-point scale. I'd be more than happy to share the survey with you if it's helpful.
With great pleasure. We read to you. Thanks.
Okay. Wonderful.
Other comments or questions?
So maybe one. Hi, Chris. Thanks. So you said briefly that there were like big effects on the children. Can you maybe say a bit more about that?
Just remind me what I said. Sorry, Nina. Just so I can get it right.
I don't know, just like answering Ignacio, you said like on top of like seeing effects on the children, you also see like improvement in well-being in teachers.
Yeah, so we were measuring, we did some measurement about how happy teachers felt and used a kind of standard well-being scale. And what we found there was what they generally felt happier as a result of being able to engage with one another, but also they kind of indicated they had more friends, or they had more positive collegial relationships with each other in the schools. The children's outcome data we took from the main study, so it was we kind of weren't measuring that. That was a kind of independent measure, really. But what we did do was we looked at kind of examples of work, and we asked the teachers themselves to present their understanding of changes in the children's work and what they could do now and what they couldn't do. And that's, I'm not suggesting that, that's a scientific way of measuring this specifically with the small sample, but it was really interesting qualitatively to see how teachers thought in those schools that these differences had been made.
And so what did they say?
Oh, well, so for example, one school was interested in they called it being a brave learner. So the ability of children to speak up, ask questions, feel confident to take risks in their learning. And they had a kind of pro forma which talked about the extent to which children would raise their hands, what they would ask about, the types of questions, whether they the number of those children increased, whether the types of questions got more intelligent, and so on. So it was a kind of, they were looking at the performance of children against a measure they had devised in terms of the inquisitiveness, the confidence of children to ask, the I guess, their resilience. So if they got told that their answer was incorrect, or to work it again, you know, how, whether that knocked their confidence or not, and that kind of thing. Sorry, Nina, I that wasn't the most comprehensive answer, because it was kind of, I'm just thinking this was a couple of years ago and I was trying to work out what else I had.
Oh, no worries. Thanks.
Anyone else?
I have another question.
Yeah,
if I may. Yeah. So I am. Do you have some examples of the kind of research use that was done by teachers in schools, following the guidance of the members of the research learning network? In particular, was it a research use that was super instrumental? Let's say this is a good practice, you could use it, or was it more conceptual? What kind of research
it was more
use?
conceptual, in the sense that, so for example, we had some schools looking at growth mindsets, and so in the professional learning network, we took them through various exercises that looked at what does the research say on growth mindsets, and we kind of produced these literature reviews that were easy to understand, that drew together different parts of research, that had, you know, kind of recommendations and suggestions, that talked about methodology and so on. And they used those to come up with ideas for interventions that might work. So rather than saying, here is an intervention that will improve growth mindsets and has been proven, we got them to use theories of action to say, here is some research, here is your understanding of the world, here's the context of your school. What do you think will make a useful intervention here, and why do you think it will work? And which bits of those understanding draw from the research you've read, which bits of that understanding draw from your own kind of professional knowledge? So we've taken a very different path from that kind of notion of fidelity and instrumental use of, you know, because I think it wanted to create agency for teachers to go, actually, if I took this idea, I think that could work in this way. And then they test it, and then they see if it's effective or not. And the other thing we talked about was, you know, because that means you can work with research that is strong or weak in terms of its methods and so on. If you've got some very strong research that's been done with randomized control trials, you can give that more weight when you develop your intervention. But if you've got stuff that's more case study based and just presents kind of ideas and inspiration, you can give that less weight, but you're still using it to influence your kind of intervention that you've developed. So we took a very different pathway from that kind of notion of what works, I think.
And just to continue, how easy or difficult was for you to produce this research synthesis on topics that were identified by teachers? Sometimes it is difficult to find, let's say, good research on a given topic, but that is pressing for teachers.
So the other thing, because we had a clustered randomized control, we had to find a topic that appeal to 5 schools. So in a sense, we gave them a menu of topics and said which of these would be of interest to you in your context. So in that way, we could kind of control a little bit by giving topics that we knew there was some research, at least, you know. So it wasn't completely open. Having said that, those topics, we came up with them also in conjunction with the school leaders by saying, you know, what matters to your school. So it was a kind of a marriage of knowing what was important to school leaders, knowing what research was there, but also making sure there was a common theme across all 5 schools. So it's a bit of a fudge, as we call it, but, you know.
All right. We're getting close to the end of this session. Is there any final question or comment here? All right. So thank you, Chris, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. And there will be another seminar in about 1 month, and you'll hear about it.
Thank you for inviting me. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much for coming.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.
Thank you.